Welcome to our deep dive, everyone. This time, we're going to be tackling the progressive era in America.
The progressive era.
A fascinating and really, I think, important period in American history, one that I think a lot of people are curious about.
Absolutely, yeah.
And, we've had some listeners write in and say, hey, I'd love to know more about this. What made this era so progressive? Was it all good?
Right.
Who are some of these, key figures, like muckraking journalists, reformers, and presidents taking on these huge corporations?
hmm
And, how did all of this end up shaping the America we know today? All great questions.
Yeah.
So to get us started, I think it's helpful to set the stage. So
Okay.
we're talking late 19th, early 20th century,
Wait.
the Gilded Age, with its extravagant wealth and robber barons.
Opulent mansions.
Yeah. But also, this was a nation wrestling with poverty, corruption,
Yeah.
and some pretty horrific working conditions. I
Yeah.
mean, just, really difficult stuff.
A nation on the brink, really?
Yeah.
I mean, you can picture these cities just bursting at the seams with new immigrants, many living in just terrible conditions,
Right.
while a very, very select few were amassing these just unimaginable fortunes.
Yeah.
And, this kind of contrast, the sense that the American dream was just slipping out of reach for so many,
Yeah.
it created a powder keg of social tension.
Totally. It's almost like, the more things change, the more they stay the same in a way.
Yeah.
So into this really volatile mix come these muckrakers.
The muckrakers.
And these weren't your average reporters. They
Wow.
were these investigative journalists who were willing to shine a light on these like really dark corners of society.
Absolutely. It was like their duty to expose the dirt, the corruption,
Right.
the exploitation that
Yeah.
was hidden beneath this veneer of progress. And they did it in a way that really captured the public's attention.
Yeah. It was like they weren't afraid to get their hands dirty.
No, not at all.
And, one of the most famous muckrakers was Jacob Riis.
Oh, yes.
And his groundbreaking work, How the Other Half Lives, he didn't just write about the poverty in New York City slums. He brought it to life with his photography.
Right.
And those images, they really shocked people.
Absolutely, yeah. Powerful stuff. It was a precursor to, the photojournalism that still moves us today.
Right.
He understood the power of capturing those really raw human moments to spark empathy and outrage.
Totally, yeah. And then you have Upton Sinclair, who took kind of a different approach.
Okay.
With his novel, The Jungle, he exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry, but he did it through this fictional story.
Right.
But it was so rooted in reality that it just ignited this public outcry for reform.
Absolutely. A perfect example of how storytelling can be a catalyst for change.
Right.
People might not always be swayed by just facts and figures, but a compelling story, something that really gets under their skin.
Yeah.
And can really move them to action.
Totally. And we actually still see his influence today, in investigative journalism that's holding powerful industries accountable.
Mm-hmm.
So these muckrakers, they weren't just reporting the news, they were really shaping it.
Absolutely.
And in doing so, they were giving a voice to the voiceless and really laying the groundwork for this huge wave of social reform that would come to define the progressive era.
Definitely.
But it wasn't just journalists. You had religious leaders stepping up, social workers, activists from all walks of life, all united by this belief that things could be better, that America could actually live up to its ideals.
Yeah, it was a really diverse group of people all pushing for change.
It was. So one of these really important figures was Jane Addams.
Oh, yes. Jane Addams.
And she founded Hull House in Chicago.
Right.
And this wasn't just some charity, this was a community center. It was this beacon of hope for immigrants and the poor.
It really was. Offering everything from childcare and education to job training, legal aid, you name it.
Yeah, it was amazing. And her work was so much more than just, giving people a handout.
Absolutely.
She really understood that true progress required, like empowering people, giving them the tools to build a better life for themselves and their families.
Right.
She really pioneered a lot of the social work practices that we still use today, emphasizing these community-based solutions
Right.
and advocating for systemic change.
A true visionary.
She was. And alongside these social reformers, you had the rise of this really interesting movement called the social gospel.
This social gospel.
And this was where religious leaders were urging their congregations to take action, to really live their faith by addressing social injustices
Right.
head on.
It's really fascinating, to see how religion became this driving force for social change.
It is.
I mean, these leaders like Walter Rauschenbusch with his book, Christianity and the Social Crisis,
Right.
they really saw this moral imperative to fight for better working conditions, to protect children from exploitation, to create a safety net for those in need.
Yeah, and they weren't just preaching from the pulpit. I
Oh,
mean, they were out in the streets, they were organizing protests,
mm,
lobbying politicians, demanding a more just and compassionate society.
exactly.
And of course, we can't forget about the women of this era. I mean, the progressive era was this pivotal time for women's rights,
Absolutely.
with suffrage being the ultimate goal, but also this push for a wider range of reforms that really touched every aspect of American life.
Absolutely.
So you had groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
Right, the WCTU.
And they went far beyond just advocating for temperance.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they tackled issues like poverty, child labor, even prison reform.
They really did. I mean, they understood that achieving true equality for women meant addressing all of these interconnected issues.
Yeah,
They were pushing for this more holistic approach to social change.
totally. And then you have these just incredible figures like Carrie A. Nation,
Yeah.
who, took a much more, let's just say, hands-on approach to fighting for temperance by actually smashing up saloons.
She was quite a character.
She was.
But, her tactics, while they might have been controversial, they definitely captured public attention.
Yeah, she wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo.
Not at all. And, in a way, she paved the way for these more radical forms of activism,
Yeah.
showing that sometimes you have to really shake things up to get people to listen.
Right. And it's also important to remember that this wasn't just a white women's movement.
No, definitely not.
Black women were also organizing,
Absolutely.
but they were facing even greater
Of
challenges
course, yes.
because of the just pervasive racism of the time.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I mean, women like Mary Church Terrell, a founder of the National Association of Colored Women,
Right.
they were fighting on two fronts.
Yeah.
They were fighting for racial uplift and for women's rights.
Right.
And, they understood that these struggles were completely intertwined,
Mm.
that to achieve true equality, you had to dismantle both sexism and racism.
Absolutely. I mean, they were demanding a seat at the table, not just for themselves, but for their entire community.
Mm-hmm.
And their work really laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement that would gain momentum in the decades to come.
It's a powerful reminder that progress often requires multiple movements working together,
Cool.
challenging not just individual injustices, but the entire system that perpetuates those injustices.
Totally. So we have this incredible groundswell of reform movements, touching nearly every aspect of American life. But amidst all of this progress, there was this darker side brewing too. The rise of big business, the growth of monopolies, and the concentration of power in the hands of just a select few.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was really a time of incredible economic growth, but also this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Right.
These massive corporations, these trusts, as they were called,
Yeah.
they just held so much power, often controlling entire industries, dictating prices, crushing competition,
Right.
even influencing government policies.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a real concern.
It sounds like, talk about an uphill battle. I mean, these reformers
Yeah,
taking on these just corporate behemoths.
it was David and Goliath.
Yeah.
But, they knew that if they wanted to create a more just and equitable society,
Mm.
they had to tackle this concentration of power
Right.
head on. And that's where you get these landmark pieces of legislation,
Okay.
like the Interstate Commerce Act
Right.
and the Sherman Antitrust Act.
So those were some of the first attempts to really rein in the power of these trusts.
Exactly. Yeah, the Interstate Commerce Act, passed in 1887, was aimed at regulating the railroads,
Okay.
which were notorious for their unfair pricing practices
Right.
and their influence over politicians.
Wow.
And it established this principle that the government had a right to regulate private industry
Okay.
for the public good.
Interesting. And then the Sherman Antitrust Act, that was passed in 1890.
Right.
That was specifically aimed at breaking up monopolies.
Exactly, yeah. The idea was to prevent these giant corporations from just stifling competition,
Okay.
controlling entire sectors of the economy. So these were, huge steps forward.
Yeah.
But they weren't perfect.
So did they actually work? I mean, what happened?
Well, the problem was, the language of these acts was often kind of vague.
Okay.
And corporations, they found loopholes.
Right. Right.
They had these armies of lawyers who could find ways to circumvent the regulations.
Of course. Yeah.
And the government often, they lacked the resources
Yeah.
and the political will
Right.
to really enforce them effectively.
So it sounds like you need someone who's really like willing to, use that power
Right.
and, go after these corporate giants.
Someone who's not afraid.
Yeah. And that's where we get these, trust busting presidents.
Trust busters.
Yeah. Teddy Roosevelt,
Right.
William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson.
Each of them took a slightly different approach,
Okay.
reflecting kind of the evolving understanding of how to deal with this corporate power.
Interesting.
Yeah, so Roosevelt, for example,
Yeah.
he wasn't entirely anti-business,
Okay.
but he believed in using the power of the federal government to regulate corporations
Right.
and prevent them from abusing their power.
Got it.
And he famously went after the Northern Securities Company,
Oh, yeah.
which was a railroad trust,
Right.
and actually successfully broke it up.
He wasn't messing around.
No, he wasn't. He was not afraid to shake things up.
No.
And then you have Taft, who followed Roosevelt,
Right.
right? And he was even more aggressive in his trust-busting efforts.
Wow.
He took on U.S. Steel, which was, the world's first billion-dollar corporation,
Wow.
which even Roosevelt thought was going too far.
Oh.
But Taft, he believed that monopolies were just inherently harmful
Okay.
to competition and to the public interest.
Interesting. And then Wilson.
Right.
He had his own, his own way of going about this.
Yeah, he did. He was more focused on promoting small businesses
Okay.
and competition.
Mm.
He believed that breaking up monopolies wasn't enough.
Yeah.
He had to create a level playing field
Right.
where small businesses could thrive.
So kind of a different approach.
Yeah, different approach. And he championed things like the Clayton Antitrust Act
Okay.
and the Federal Trade Commission, which really strengthened the government's ability to regulate corporations and prevent unfair business practices.
So it's interesting how you have these three presidents, all considered, progressive, but they had these really different approaches.
Yeah, it's really
To
interesting.
the same problem.
It highlights, I think, the complexity of this era.
Yeah.
And the challenges they faced in trying to balance, economic growth with social justice. And it's a debate that's still going on today,
Totally.
right? This whole role of government in the economy, how to regulate corporations, promote competition,
Yeah.
it is really fascinating.
It makes you wonder what these reformers would think, if they could see the state of corporate power today.
I know. Right?
But before we go too far down that road,
Yeah.
let's shift gears a bit and talk about another really key concern that emerges during the progressive era,
Okay.
and that's the environment.
The environment, yeah. It's fascinating to see how amidst all of this, this social and political turmoil,
Yeah.
people were also starting to pay attention to the impact of industrialization and development on the natural world.
It's easy to forget, I think, this was a time when pollution was rampant.
Okay.
Forests were being clear-cut at an alarming rate.
Mhm.
Wildlife populations were dwindling. There was this growing sense that something had to be done to protect the natural world.
Right.
And not just for its own sake, but for the well-being of, future generations.
Absolutely, yeah. And within this movement, you had these two kind of distinct and sometimes competing philosophies,
Okay.
preservation
Right.
and conservation.
So what's the difference?
Well, preservationists,
Yeah.
like John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club,
Right.
they believed in protecting these pristine wilderness areas from any kind of development.
Okay.
They saw nature as having this intrinsic value,
Yeah.
something to be cherished and preserved for its beauty and its spiritual significance.
Okay. So protecting it from human, interference.
Right, exactly. Hands off.
Okay.
And then you have the conservationists,
Right.
like Gifford Pinchot,
Okay.
who was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service.
Right.
They had a different perspective.
Okay.
Pinchot believed in managing natural resources for efficient use, for what he called the greatest good for the greatest number.
Right.
He believed in using science and technology to ensure the sustainable use of resources, like forests and water and minerals.
So it's more about, responsible use.
Exactly, yeah,
Right.
responsible use.
Okay.
So, it was this question of, should we protect nature from human interference altogether?
Right.
Or should we find ways to use it responsibly?
Yeah.
And it all kind of came to a head with this debate over the Hetchy Valley.
Hetchy.
Yeah.
I've heard of this.
Yeah, it was this beautiful, pristine valley
Uh-huh.
in Yosemite National Park.
Right.
And San Francisco wanted to dam it.
Okay.
to create a reservoir
Right.
to provide water for the city. And this sparked this just huge battle
Wow.
between the preservationists who wanted to protect the valley
Right.
and the conservationists who saw the dam as this, necessary step to meet the needs of this growing population.
That's a tough
That
question.
was a tough question.
Yeah.
It must have been heartbreaking for those who wanted to preserve the valley.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful example of the difficult choices we face.
Right.
When trying to balance human needs with environmental protection.
It's tough.
It is.
Mhm.
And ultimately, the conservationists won that battle.
Yeah.
The dam was built and the valley was flooded.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a reminder that progress, often comes at a cost.
Right.
And that sometimes we have to make these difficult choices
Yeah.
between these competing values.
Totally. But, it's important to remember that the progressive era environmental movement was about a lot more than just protecting wilderness areas.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So what else were they focused on?
Well, reformers like Jane Addams
Right.
and Florence Kelley, they were tackling things like urban sanitation
Okay.
and public health issues, advocating for cleaner streets,
Right.
better housing,
Yeah.
safer working conditions.
Right.
You also had activists like Dr. Alice Hamilton,
Okay.
who was a pioneer in this field of industrial hygiene,
Okay.
investigating workplace hazards and advocating for worker safety.
So they were really looking at the whole picture, recognizing that environmental issues were also, really connected to social and economic issues.
Absolutely, yeah. It was a very holistic approach,
Yeah.
which, is something we can definitely learn from today as we grapple with these,
Yeah.
even more complex environmental challenges.
Right, totally. So we've got this incredible, just burst of reform efforts, tackling everything from corporate power to women's rights to environmental protection. But as you mentioned earlier, there was this kind of darker side to this era,
Right.
particularly when it came to race relations.
Yeah,
It's kind of this tragic paradox
it is.
that while some reformers were fighting for this more just and equitable society, the progressive era also sees the rise of Jim Crow
Right.
and this intensification of racial discrimination.
Yeah, especially in the South.
It's really hard to reconcile,
Yeah.
those two realities, the progress
Yeah.
and the oppression kind of happening side by side. So how did African Americans navigate this incredibly complex and challenging time?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a truly tragic chapter, in American history.
It is.
While some were striving for, a more equitable nation,
Right.
others were actively working to, disenfranchise and segregate Black Americans.
Yeah.
It's
hard to wrap your head around.
It is. It is. I mean, imagine this system that's designed to just strip away your basic rights
Right.
and your dignity.
Yeah.
Jim Crow laws were enacted
Right.
across the South.
Right.
Enforcing segregation in just about every aspect of life.
Yeah.
Schools, transportation, public restrooms,
Right.
even cemeteries.
It's just
Separate and unequal just became the norm.
Yeah, and it wasn't just these, state-sanctioned laws. I mean,
Yeah.
there was this constant threat of violence.
Right.
The ever-present fear of lynching.
No.
Just, these daily indignities that just wore down the spirit and just stifled opportunity.
It was a system of oppression, really.
Yeah.
And to add insult to injury, these laws were often upheld by the highest court in the land.
Right.
The Supreme Court's decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, establishing this separate but equal doctrine,
Right.
it was just a devastating blow
Yeah.
to racial equality.
Yeah.
I mean, it legitimized segregation
Right.
and created this legal framework for decades of discrimination.
So in the midst of all of this, this oppression, how did African Americans respond? I mean, did they just accept their fate?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, Black Americans resisted this injustice in countless ways.
Yeah.
From everyday acts of defiance
Right.
to organized movements for social change.
Yeah.
They built their own institutions.
Right.
Schools, churches, businesses, creating these spaces of, empowerment and solidarity.
Right. And within this context of resistance, we see these two, really prominent Black leaders emerge who offered these different and sometimes conflicting visions for progress.
Right.
Booker T. Washington.
Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yeah.
Two brilliant men,
Yeah.
both deeply committed to racial uplift.
Right.
But their approaches were just worlds apart.
Right.
Washington, who had experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand.
Right.
He believed in this, more gradual approach.
Okay.
He advocated for economic self-sufficiency
Right.
and vocational training as this path to eventual equality.
Okay.
His famous Atlanta Compromise speech delivered to a predominantly white audience.
Right.
He encouraged Black people to focus on practical skills, economic advancement,
Right.
essentially accepting segregation as a temporary reality.
Right.
It was a controversial stance,
Yeah.
even at the time.
Yeah.
Critics, including Du Bois,
Right.
they saw it as accommodating to white supremacy.
Right.
The betrayal of the fight for full and immediate equality.
Okay.
But Washington argued that it was a pragmatic strategy in a hostile environment, a way to build a foundation for future progress.
Right.
Du Bois, on the other hand,
Yeah.
Harvard-educated scholar and activist,
Right.
he rejected any compromise with segregation.
Okay.
I mean, he demanded full civil rights and equality,
Right.
nothing less.
Wow.
And he saw education,
Oh.
particularly higher education,
Right.
as crucial for developing Black leadership
Okay.
and challenging racial stereotypes.
Right.
He co-founded the NAACP
Right.
and used his powerful writing and speeches
Mm.
to really expose the injustices of Jim Crow and just galvanize this fight for racial justice.
Yeah, he was such a powerful voice.
He was a firebrand, a visionary,
Yeah.
who inspired generations of activists.
Absolutely. And, this debate between Washington and Du Bois, this kind of tension between accommodation and confrontation,
Right.
I mean, it continues to resonate today.
It does.
As we wrestle with these issues of systemic racism and inequality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that there are often multiple paths to progress,
Right.
and that even within a single movement,
Yeah.
there can be these disagreements
Right.
about the best way forward.
Right. Totally.
And those disagreements, those debates, they're often a sign of a healthy and vibrant movement.
Right.
It's when everyone agrees,
Yeah.
when there's no room for dissent,
Yeah.
that we should be worried.
That's a good point. So, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've seen the highs and lows of the progressive era, the inspiring reforms, the tragic shortcomings. It's been a roller coaster of emotions.
It has. It has.
Yeah.
But that's, what makes history so compelling. It's not just a collection of facts and dates.
Right.
It's a story, of human struggle
Yeah.
and triumph, of hope and despair, of progress and setbacks.
And what stands out to you, as the most enduring legacy of this era? What should our listener, really take away from all of this?
For me, it's this idea that ordinary people can make a difference.
Right.
The progressive era was a testament to the power of collective action,
Yeah.
of citizens coming together to demand a better world. And, these weren't just presidents and politicians driving change.
Right.
It was everyday people,
Yeah.
journalists, activists, social workers, religious leaders,
Right.
all pushing for progress.
It's inspiring to think about.
It is.
That we all have the potential
We do.
to be those change makers.
And, the lessons of the progressive era, both the successes and the failures, they can really guide us
Yeah.
as we navigate the challenges of our own time.
Right.
Whether it's fighting for economic justice, protecting the environment, dismantling systemic racism. The spirit of the progressive era, I think, can still inspire us to create a more just and equitable society.
Well said. It's a good reminder, that history isn't just something we learn about. It's something we live and breathe and we shape with our own actions. So to our listener, we encourage you to, keep exploring, keep questioning.
Absolutely.
Find your own way to make a difference in the world. And remember, as the progressives taught us, progress is a journey.
It is.
Not a destination.
That's right.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.